This program contains graphic recreations of scenes of historic brutality, including torture and hangings, which may distress some viewers. This is the British Isles, 400 years ago.
You will be hanged by the neck until you are dead.
Mass trials and executions erupted across the country. And the reason for this chaos and violence was witches.
Devil's horn!
People were convinced they sank ships, brought famine and disease, murdered and maimed, because witches worked for Satan. Hundreds of innocent people were persecuted,
Thou a witch?
tortured, and put to death in a hysterical effort to stamp out the scourge of witchcraft. Imagine living in that world. You could be accused, tortured, and executed on the basis of nothing more than gossip and superstition. How could such a deadly and violent idea have got so out of control in Britain? What drove the persecutors to such awful lengths? And what was it like for the victims who were tortured and executed for crimes they couldn't possibly have committed?
Behind me!
This is the extraordinary story of how the terror of satanic witchcraft infected the British Isles and plunged it into chaos. Queen Anne's ships had been battered by a violent storm. One ship sank, Anne's almost capsized. The badly damaged convoy had limped back to Scandinavia. King James decided he would have to go and fetch his new wife himself. But James would bring back far more than just a new queen from Denmark. James arrived here at Kronborg Castle near Copenhagen in January 1590. His crossing had been equally violent. The world James walked into was very different to his native Scotland. Witch hysteria was infecting mainland Europe. Hundreds had already been executed as witches. Tens of thousands would follow. The violence, fear, and hysteria spreading across Europe were largely the result of one incendiary book. Here at the Royal Danish Library is one of the very few original copies.
This is the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of the Witches. It was principally written by one German Dominican monk called Heinrich Kramer, and he wrote it to argue that witches existed and that they worked for the devil. It was a legal manual for the hunting and executing of witches.
The Malleus Maleficarum pushed Cranmer's terrifying belief that witches were obsessed with poisoning, maiming, and killing, and they were doing it for Satan. Their aim was to harm, to murder, and to destroy. And if witches were the problem, the Malleus was the answer.
It was a hugely influential book, and one of the reasons it was so influential is printed at the front. This is a papal bull, the Pope's equivalent of a royal proclamation. It was issued in 1484, just before the Malleus was published, and it stated that witches were heretics who had made an alliance with the devil.
Cranmer reprinted the bull to prove that the church stood behind his book. Because it appeared to have the church's backing, the Malleus Maleficarum led to the wholesale torture and murder of thousands of people suspected of being in league with the devil. This idea that witches were the devil's handmaidens, hell-bent on death and chaos, hadn't yet reached James's kingdom. But in Denmark, he came face to face with the reality of Satan's witches. In April 1590, while James was still at Kronborg Castle, 2 witches were arrested in Copenhagen. And what was truly shocking was that they confessed to conjuring up the violent storms that had hit James and Anne's ships. They had attempted to murder the Scottish king and queen because Satan wanted them dead. At least 5 more witches were later convicted of the same crime. All were burned at the stake. But if James thought he'd left the scourge of witchcraft behind him when he returned to Scotland, he was wrong. With the Danish witches dead, the whole thing might have become nothing more than a historical footnote, and James might have lived out his reign untroubled by the devil, if it were not for one man. His name was David Seaton, and he was the deputy bailiff here in the small town of Trennant, 9 miles east of Edinburgh. What Seaton did in November 1590 proved to James that the devil and his witches were alive and well in Scotland. He claimed his young housemaid, Gillis Duncan, had suddenly acquired healing powers, and he'd seen her slipping out at night. According to a contemporary source, Seaton believed only one thing could explain her furtive behavior: witchcraft. And he was going to prove it.
Where have you been?
I was tending to the garden, sir.
Lie to me! Is that a witch?
No, sir. Please, sir, no.
The story of Seaton and Gillis is recorded in this pamphlet, first published in 1591. It's called News from Scotland, and it tells us exactly what Seaton did next. Her master did, with the help of others, torment her with the torture of the pillywinks. Pillywinks are thumbscrews. They crushed the flesh and bones of the fingers. Victims were often left permanently crippled.
Are you a witch?
No, sir. No, sir.
Where'd you get the power to heal?
It's not magic, sir.
Gillis must have endured unbearable pain, but she would not confess to something that she had not done. Seaton didn't stop at thumbscrews.
Where'd you go at night? Tell me the truth. I won't stand any more of your lies.
He turned instead to wrenching. As the rope was pulled tight, it crushed the head. It could fracture the skull and facial bones. Gillis would not yield. But the more she resisted confessing, the harder Seaton tried to break her.
Confess, damn you!
I don't think Seaton's actions had much to do with witch hunting. I think his motives were sexual. Perhaps he'd lusted after her for a long time and felt that, as master, he had a right to have her. It doesn't take a huge leap to imagine that a young woman sneaking out at night might have been having a sexual liaison with someone other than Seton. Whatever was driving him, I don't think that Seton could possibly have appreciated the death and suffering that would result from his obsession. In Europe, King James VI had seen that witches working for the devil had been hell-bent on killing him. He was about to receive proof that this dangerous belief was infecting Scotland too.
Tell me the truth.
The man responsible was bailiff David Seton. He was systematically brutalizing and torturing his housemaid, Gillis Duncan, to make her confess to being a witch. But Gillis would not yield. Seton began to search her body, because people believed the devil always left a mark on the bodies of his disciples. It could be anything: a mole, a birthmark. Seton found what he was looking for on Gillis's neck. And for some reason, this is what broke her.
All I've done is by witchcraft. And with the enticements of the devil himself, I rode to the town where a witch was received in service of the devil. I danced in the rank with the others.
We'll never know why Gillis confessed now, after she'd resisted thumbscrews and wrenching. Perhaps the mark was from a sexual liaison, and in this highly religious time, she felt too much shame and guilt. Gillis's confession had a seismic impact. It was the first recorded incident of a Scottish witch admitting to working for the devil. It set in train a sequence of events that would kill hundreds of people. The repercussions would last 100 years. In November 1590, Gillis Duncan was brought here to the old Tolbooth prison, one of Edinburgh's most notorious jails. The old prison no longer stands, but what does remain is the stone heart of Midlothian that was at the doorway. Gillis would have walked over this heart as she entered her period of incarceration. Gillis admitted to being part of a coven. She gave up the names of 8 other witches. They, in turn, named more. In total, over 100 people were hunted down and tortured. This raised the stakes enormously. It was no longer an isolated case of witchcraft. It was now a conspiracy of witches. Under torture, Gillis said that her coven had been in league with witches from Copenhagen, the ones who'd been executed for attempting to murder King James and his queen. This was dynamite. It changed everything. It got the king's full attention. And he did something almost unheard of. He became directly involved in the case. The person who had the most profound effect on King James was one of those named by Gillis Duncan, a woman called Agnes Sampson. Agnes was a midwife from Edinburgh. She was accused of being the most senior witch in the coven. And under torture, she too confessed to the attempted murder of King James. Agnes Sampson was taken down there to Holyrood House, James VI's official residence, not once, but twice. to be directly interrogated by the king himself. Agnes repeated the confession that had been beaten out of her in jail, that her coven had met with the devil.
We met in the kirk at North Berwick. The plan was to raise a storm for staying of the Queen's coming home. He told me of the Michaelmas storm and that it would do great damage both at sea and land. He said it should be hard for the King to come home and the Queen should never come.
James saw himself as a highly intellectual king. He read widely and was fascinated by both natural philosophy and the new ideas of rational investigation. Agnes's confession did not convince him.
She's not but a liar.
No lying, sire.
According to James, Agnes repeated pillow talk between the king and his new bride on their wedding night, when they were alone. This was enough to convince him that Agnes must be a witch. It certainly sounded like magic. But whatever James may have believed, in reality there was little privacy for a 16th century king, even in bed. Possibly a juicy piece of gossip escaped the palace, or maybe the experienced midwife simply made an educated guess. But that leaves one big question. Why did Agnes go to such great lengths in order to seal her own fate? Possibly this lowly woman enjoyed her moment in the limelight. She had a chance to meet the king and maybe even scare him. But I think there may be a simpler explanation. It ended her torture. Agnes had been imprisoned in one of the worst jails in Scotland. She had been tortured, and she probably knew that this marked effectively the end of her life. So the best that she could hope for was to ease her suffering. And in that, at least, she was successful. James ordered that her torture should cease. In James's mind, there was now clear evidence that an international satanic conspiracy was out to kill him. And there was only one way to stop them. Kill them first. On the 28th of January 1591, Agnes Sampson was brought here to Castle Hill in Edinburgh to be executed. We don't know how many other convicted witches were with her that day, but we do know that she wasn't alone. These were innocent, confused and terrified people. People who had been imprisoned and tortured. People who had been prepared to say anything to stop the pain. All the victims were probably garroted before the fires were lit. It was considered a mercy. And compared to burning to death, it probably was. As the convicted witches burned, the air would have been thick with the stench of burning human fat. It would have seeped into the crowd's hair, their clothes, even the porous walls of the surrounding buildings. Of 200 people who'd been accused, around 70 had been found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to death. Gillis Duncan, the young housemaid who started it all, rotted in prison for a further year, before she too was burnt at the stake. These events became known as the North Berwick Witch Trials. They convinced James that satanic witchcraft threatened his land and his life. And the king's personal involvement in the trials gave witch hunting the stamp of royal approval. Over the next few years, the infection spread across Scotland. In East Lothian, 62 people were accused, 33 in Fife, 86 in Aberdeen, and 11 in Ross. Few doubted that the devil and his handmaidens stalked the earth, at least in Scotland.
Until now, England had largely escaped the curse of mass witchcraft trials. But on the 24th of March 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died, and her cousin James claimed the throne.
James carried the witchcraft infection south to England. But how it happened was totally unexpected. Had high hopes for their new king. He was young, male, and already had a couple of sons as heirs. After 45 years of childless Queen Elizabeth I, it seemed too good to be true.
But James was an unknown quantity, a foreign king in an alien land. His new subjects wanted to know what their new ruler was like, what were his interests, what were his beliefs, and which way was the wind blowing in this new regime?
Well, they had one big clue. A book published in London, written by James himself. It was called Demonology. This is the only book ever written by a reigning monarch on the subject of witchcraft and the devil. James sets out his reason for writing in the preface. He says, "The fearful abounding at this time in this country of these detestable slaves of the devil, the witches or enchanters, hath moved me, beloved reader, to dispatch in post this following treatise of mine. And the purpose of it," he says, "is to resolve the doubting hearts of many." This is pretty unequivocal stuff. What he's saying is that there are witches everywhere in Scotland, that they are Satan's minions, and that everyone better believe it. James sets the book out in the form of a dialogue between two characters. So we have Philomathes and Epistemon. Epistemon is the thoroughly knowledgeable one, the rational man who knows all about witchcraft. He's undoubtedly James himself. And over the course of the book, Epistemon convinces Philomathes that actually witches are real, that they should be prosecuted by the correct authorities, and that anyone who doubts their existence is at best fooling himself, and at worst in league with the devil. The book was very popular with the English. It was republished in London at least twice. Demonology gave English people an insight into their new king. And what they saw was a man hell-bent on hunting down Satan's witches. And in 1605, James once again became involved in a case of witchcraft. But this time in England. Here at Exeter College, Oxford, the country finally saw their new witch-hunting king taking on the satanic scourge. In August, a wealthy and well-connected man gained an audience with King James. His name was Brian Gunter.
Gunter had a problem with a witch. Now, I think it's quite likely that Gunter had read James's book, Demonology. And this was enough to convince him that the king would share his hatred of witches.
Gunter presented his daughter Anne to the king and claimed that she had been cursed by 3 witches.
The affliction first beset her around midsummer. Her fits are violent, and her body contorts, and when she's in the throes, she vomits pins or pulls them from her nose. My daughter is bewitched, sire. Anne has seen her tormentors in her fits. The first is Goodwife Gregory, the second is Mary People, and the third is Mother Pepwell.
Is this true?
Yes, sire.
Gunter wanted the king to bring the witches to justice. But James did something completely unexpected.
James ordered that Anne be examined by the Archbishop of Canterbury, a noted skeptic. And it didn't take the Archbishop's team of investigators long to figure out that Anne was faking the symptoms.
On the 10th of October, King James wrote to his chief minister about the case.
For your better satisfaction touching Anne Gunter, we find by her confession that she was never possessed with any devil, that the practice of the pins grew at first from a pin that she put in her mouth, affirmed by her father.
Brian Gunter was the brains behind the deception. He was seeking revenge against one of the accused, and he tried using James to get it. He was fined for wasting the king's time and thrown into jail for 3 years. He'd got off comparatively lightly. If he'd succeeded, the women would have been executed. Gunter had entirely misread the new king.
King James's actions in the Gunter case seemed completely at odds with his reputation as a rabid witch hunter. So what was really going on? I think the answer lies in his book, Demonology. If you read it, you're left in no doubt at all that James wholeheartedly believed in Satan and witches. But demonology is no Malleus Maleficarum. It's not trying to use fear to whip people up into a frenzy of witch hatred. It's an opportunity to make a case by rational argument rather than by mere superstition. It's designed as much to make sure the wrong people aren't convicted as the right people are.
James was a philosopher, or at least that's how he saw himself. But the subtleties of his bookish ideas were almost certainly lost on most of his subjects. Like Brian Gunter, they probably took demonology at face value, a license from the king to hunt witches and kill them.
This misunderstanding of James's ideas would light a touch paper that over the next 100 years would lead to the worst excesses of witch hunting in English history.
Seven years after the Gunter incident, the era of mass witch trials exploded in the English courts. It began here in Pendle, Lancashire. On the 18th of March, 1612, a girl called Alison Device was near the town of Colne in Pendle when she spied an elderly peddler called John Law.
Spare a pin, sir?
Alison didn't like being ignored. She cursed the peddler. From the description of John Law's condition, paralysis down the left side, loss of speech, it seems likely that he'd suffered a stroke. But from Alison's terrified point of view, it was her curse that had struck him down. Alison came from a family of cunning folk, local healers who used herbs and sometimes magic to cure people. So it would have been natural for her to believe in the power of her curse. Horrified by what she'd done, Alison Device confessed. She was hauled up in front of local magistrate Roger Knoll. Alison admitted to cursing the peddler, but according to a report made at the time, she went much further.
I demanded that the peddler let me buy some pins from him, and the peddler refused to open his pack. As I parted from him, there appeared a black dog. Black dog said unto me, "What wouldst thou have me do unto yonder man?" I said, "What canst thou do unto him?" And the black dog said, "I can lame him." And I said, "Lame him."
Alison accused her grandmother and 2 neighbours of being witches as well. Knoll began arresting the suspects named by Alison.
On the 2nd of April, Alison Device, her grandmother, old Demdike, their neighbour, old Chattox, and her daughter, Anne Redfern, were brought here to Lancaster Castle Prison. And they were kept in the bottom of this tower. It's still known as the Witch's Tower to this day.
All the accused were interrogated. 8 further suspects, including all of Alison's family, joined them in the tower. This is the very cell where they were kept. And along with the 12 suspected witches, there were another 8, we know, prisoners who were unrelated to the witch trial. So that's 20 people in this space. It must be 12 foot by 17, 18 foot. Quite something to imagine that the suspected witches, just ordinary people, were kept in here for 4 months. And some of them were very old, they were in the 80s. Others, people like Alison, were as a teenager, and they were in here in the dark for all that time, awaiting their death. Knoll probably couldn't believe his luck. A rural magistrate lived a humdrum life with few opportunities. Now Knoll found himself heading up a high-profile witch hunt. If he secured convictions, this could make his career. But that was easier said than done. Of all the cases that made it to court, 3/4 failed due to lack of evidence. All Knoll had were accusations and counter-accusations. What he needed was proof. And it was King James who inadvertently gave it to him. The era of mass witch hunting in England led to the torture and murder of hundreds of people. It all began here on the 17th of August, 1612, with the prosecution of the Pendle Witches, one of the most infamous witch trials in English history. This is the site of the original courtroom in Lancaster Castle, where the Pendle Witches were tried. Although it's now a library, the courtroom has only shifted a few feet, just through here. The courtroom was a hive of activity. People packed the public gallery to see the sensational trial. The judge was Sir Edward Bromley. Roger Knoll was the prosecuting magistrate. A guilty verdict could be a huge boost to his career. Thomas Potts was the court clerk. And we know the detail of this trial because he later published his records in this book. Over the next 2 days, 19 suspects stood trial, accused of using witchcraft to harm or kill. There should have been 20, but Alison's grandmother, old Demdike, had already died in that cramped and stinking cell in the Witch's Tower.
I demanded that the peddler let me buy a pin off him, but the peddler refused.
Unfortunately, Alison Device felt such remorse for cursing the peddler that she didn't even try to defend herself.
So I said, blame him.
She repeated her confession and was quickly found guilty.
Devil's whore!
The next to take the stand was Alison's mother, Elizabeth Device.
You are accused that Good Friday past you dined at Moking Tower with persons you knew to be witches. At your meeting together you talked about killing the constable and blowing up Lancaster Castle.
I deny any such meeting or talk.
Your spirit, Paul, did appear to you in the form of a black dog. Athelshead's spirit bid you to make a picture in clay after the said John Robinson, which you then did burn with fire and crumble.
That is not true.
The case was deadlocked between accusation and denial. But Roger Knoll had a secret weapon. Elizabeth Device's own daughter, 9-year-old Janet.
My mother is a witch.
Curse on you! Curse on you! What are you saying? Why are you saying this? You stupid girl, do you not know what you do? Shut up, girl! Shut up!
Silence!
No! That demon will come for thou and ravage thy mind! I will snuff out thy children with my own bare hands!
Silence!
I cannot speak with my mother here.
Take her out!
A curse on you!
The testimony of a child would not normally be allowed under English law. But King James's book, Demonology, promoted its use in witch trials. And because of that, Janet's confession was accepted. And the fate of the witches was sealed.
My mother is a witch, and that I know to be true. I've seen her spirit many times in the likeness of a brown dog that she called Bull. And at one time I did see Bull ask Mother what she would have him to do, and Mother answered that she would have Bull to help her kill.
Little Janet named names.
the wife of Hugh Hargraves, Christopher Howgate, Elizabeth his wife, Dick Miles and his wife, Christopher Ajax of the Thorny Holm and his wife, and my brother, James Device, has been a witch for 3 years.
We'll never know why Janet testified against her own family. Maybe she thought they really were witches. Maybe she liked being the centre of attention. Or maybe, given the way that her mother shouted at her and threatened her in court, she was badly treated, and she thought that this was an escape. But I suspect the 9-year-old didn't understand the full consequences of what she said. And maybe Noel bullied and brainwashed her into saying what she did, just as Brian Gunter had done.
At the end of a 2-day trial, 10 of the 19 accused were found guilty of witchcraft. Janet's entire family was convicted.
You will be taken to the execution grounds for this country, where you will be hanged by the neck until you are dead. May God have mercy upon your souls.
On the 20th of August, the day after the trial, the 10 convicted witches were brought here, to a place still known as Gallows Hill, to be hanged. Perhaps under similarly grim skies, the crowds would have gathered to see the spectacle, to see the old, unloved, despised witches meet their fate. And maybe amongst them there would have been the young girl who had condemned her family, her own mother, to meet the rough rope and the short drop.
It was a gruesome form of execution. The drop wasn't high enough to break their necks. Instead, they died by agonizingly slow strangulation. Janet disappears from the historical records after the trial, but the name Janet Device is listed as one of a group of 20 witches tried in Lancaster 22 years later. It appears that she was convicted and probably died in jail. We can't be sure if it was the same girl, but it would be a cruel form of poetic justice if it was. The Pendle trials were a watershed. They triggered 100 years of institutionalized murder in England. And the blame for that must lie, at least partly, with King James. His book, Demonology, sanctioned forms of evidence and torture that drove the worst excesses of witch hunting. He would have been mortified.
Pendle was everything the rational James disliked. A case based on hearsay, manipulation, and petty jealousies, rather than based on scripture, evidence, and due process of law. James knew it was as terrible a thing to condemn the innocent as to let the guilty go unpunished, and he'd written Demonology as a manual to prevent precisely that. But James failed to grasp how other people would see a book written by the king on the prosecution of witches. And over the next 50 years or so, this misjudgment would lead to hundreds of innocent people being sentenced to death.
Next time, witch hunting brings terror to England. Not just of witches, but of the man who was hunting them down.
Somebody there?
Welcome to the world of the Witchfinder General.
Tell me the truth. I am your confessor.
This is the British Isles, 400 years ago.
You will be hanged by the neck until you are dead.
Mass trials and executions erupted across the country. And the reason for the chaos and violence? Witches. People were convinced they sank ships, brought famine and disease, murdered and maimed. Because witches worked for Satan. Hundreds of innocent people were persecuted, tortured, and put to death in a hysterical effort to stamp out the scourge of witchcraft.
Imagine living in that world. You could be accused, tortured, and executed on the basis of nothing more than gossip and superstition. How could such a deadly and violent idea have got so out of control in Britain? What drove the persecutors to such awful lengths? And what was it like for the victims who were tortured and executed for crimes they couldn't possibly have committed?
For over 100 years, shocking witch trials swept across the British Isles. And the most infamous figure in that whole terrifying century was Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General.
Tell me the truth. I am your confessor.
This is the sleepy village of Manningtree on the River Stour in Essex. In 1645, something apparently trivial happened here that grew to engulf this corner of England in a frenzy of paranoia that would leave more than 100 innocent people dead. It all started with a sick woman.
She was the wife of local tailor John Rivet. On March 21st, 1645, Rivet petitioned two magistrates who were visiting Manningtree. He believed they could save her.
My wife has been struck down by an all-consuming fever that threatens her life. At first, she complained of dizziness and nausea, but now she is confined to her bed. Her body flushed, hot and cold, her senses dulled. This is something more than merely natural. My wife is bewitched.
To people of the time, this was a completely rational explanation. Witches were as real to them as the ground beneath their feet and the sun above their heads. They believed the devil made a pact with witches, sealed by sex, and that the devil gave witches supernatural powers to maim and to kill. People were terrified of them.
In the 17th century, life was often nasty, brutish, and short. Everyone was looking for someone to blame when things went wrong, so it makes sense that a person like John Rivet grasped at witchcraft as an explanation for his wife's otherwise inexplicable illness.
My wife is bewitched by Elizabeth Clark.
Elizabeth Clark was well known around Manningtree. She was around 80 years old, she was a widow, she was poor, and she had only one leg. She was also famously cantankerous, much given to cursing, and with a quick temper. She wasn't well liked.
Rivet wanted Elizabeth convicted and executed to save his wife. But even in the 17th century, accusations alone were not grounds for arrest. And so it might have ended there if it hadn't been for one man. Local landowner John Stern.
We have evidence to support John Rivet's claim.
Stern carried eyewitness statements that would transform this from a minor local incident into a catastrophe. In the statements, locals said Elizabeth Clark had not only refused to deny being a witch, she'd also claimed to know plenty of other witches, so they'd better watch their tongues. Stern's eyewitness accounts changed everything. The magistrates gave Stern a warrant to investigate the claims. It backed him with the full weight of the law. He could use anything, short of torture, to question Elizabeth Clark and any other suspected witches living in Essex. Essentially, they'd given Stern, a man with no legal status at all, a freelance license to hunt down witches. It was this warrant that started the most brutal witch hunt in English history. But it wasn't Stern who would drive it. It was a young man standing quietly at the back of the room. His name was Matthew Hopkins. Matthew Hopkins was born in the 1620s. Though we don't know exactly what year, what we do know is that his father was a strict Puritan preacher. From an early age, Matthew would have been immersed in his father's faith. He was brought up to believe that it wasn't enough just to believe in Christ. He also needed to demonstrate his faith through public acts. And in that Manningtree meeting room, Hopkins saw an opportunity to do just that. Hopkins offered to help Stern investigate Elizabeth Clark. But proving her guilty would not be easy. King Charles I had suppressed witch hunting by requiring extremely demanding standards of evidence. In the last 20 years, very few witches had been convicted. But Charles was now losing control, and civil war had broken out. This violent chaos came as no surprise to the Puritans who dominated East Anglia. They were expecting it. They believed it signalled the end days, before the apocalypse, when the devil would walk the earth. So finding witches living amongst them was exactly what they had anticipated. This collision between the terrifying chaos of war and rigid Puritan beliefs created the perfect conditions for witch hunting. So Hopkins' opportunistic approach to Stern was perfectly timed. Stern accepted his help. Matthew Hopkins was on his way to launching the most brutal witch hunts in English history. Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, two men with no legal training whatsoever, had been given a warrant to interrogate suspected witch Elizabeth Clark. On Friday the 21st of March, 1645, a group of women chosen by Hopkins and Stern went to Elizabeth's cottage.
Get her!
The women stripped and searched her, looking for the devil's mark.
Thank you.
People believed that the pact between the devil and the witch was consummated with sex. He would then mark her body. The devil often concealed these marks beneath the witch's body hair. The searchers would do whatever it took to find it. A devil's mark could be any skin blemish, a mole, even an age spot. So the chance of finding something on an elderly woman was pretty high. Finally, they found the mark, hidden on Elizabeth's genitals.
This was an appalling level of casual brutality. Imagine the shame and humiliation for Elizabeth Clark. Remember, we're talking about an old and disabled woman. As a widow, she didn't even have the protection of a husband.
But the mark alone wasn't enough. To be certain of a conviction, they needed Elizabeth to confess. Hopkins and Stern's warrant restricted them to operating within the law, which excluded torture. So to get what they needed, they would have to be creative. Elizabeth Clark was tied to a chair and deprived of sleep.
Wake up, old woman!
In the 17th century, sleep deprivation, by the thinnest of margins, was legal.
Are you a witch?
No, not I.
Hopkins' henchmen worked on Elizabeth in shifts, keeping her awake for 3 days and nights.
Wake up!
But Elizabeth Clark must have been tough as old boots, because she still would not confess. On the 3rd day, Hopkins and Stern paid her a visit. It was the first time Hopkins had come face to face with Elizabeth.
Do you know who I am, old woman? I'm your confessor. When did you sign a pact with the devil? What sins have you committed in his name? Continue.
Hopkins was never going to give up. It was all too much for Elizabeth.
Stop. Please stop.
Talk then, old woman. In what form did the devil come to you?
He was a tall, proper, black-haired gentleman. A properer man than you yourself. Come to me 3 or 4 times in a week. To my bedchamber. And go to bed with me. I never deny him.
Imagine the depths of degradation to which Elizabeth had been exposed. She'd been brutalized, starved, and denied water and sleep. And although she was clearly made of strong stuff, the elderly widow finally broke. That gave her the dubious privilege of becoming Hopkins' first victim.
And what Elizabeth did next doomed many more victims to follow her. She said that she was part of a coven. There were more witches out there for Hopkins to hunt down.
After torturing Elizabeth Clark, Matthew Hopkins and John Stern used her confession to forge new careers for themselves, careers that had never previously existed in England. They became freelance witch hunters.
Hopkins and Stern used the Manningtree warrant to begin hunting down the people Elizabeth Clark had named. Elizabeth was arrested in March. 6 more arrests followed in April. By June, as Hopkins and Stern hit their stride, the number had swollen to at least 30.
The suspects were brought here to Colchester Castle. And conditions in this jail were appalling. The prisoners were shackled day and night and routinely beaten by the guards. There was no light, no space, no sanitation.
By June, 4 prisoners had already died, most probably from typhus.
On the 17th of July 1645, the survivors were herded onto carts bound for the courts at Chelmsford. For many of them, it wasn't the first time they'd been arrested for witchcraft, but previous cases had been dismissed for lack of evidence. Perhaps they expected the same result this time. If so, they reckoned without Matthew Hopkins' zeal. He was determined to rid the world of Satan's agents.
Elizabeth Clark was tried with the first group of suspects. Hopkins recorded the details of the case himself.
How do you plead?
I am innocent.
The court was in uproar. At the back, spectators heckled and hissed from the gallery, and the judge intervened whenever he saw fit.
Then, into the chaos of the courtroom, stepped Matthew Hopkins.
Clark was apprehended and searched, and found upon her 3 teats. So upon command from the justice, they kept her from sleep 2 or 3 nights. Immediately after this witch confesses several other witches.
Hopkins had something that recent trials had lacked: the confession that he'd extracted from Elizabeth.
The confession of a witch, in my judgment, is enough to hang a witch.
And Hopkins had a secret weapon to convict the rest of the coven. Her name was Rebecca West. He had singled her out in jail and offered her freedom if she gave evidence against the others. The alternative was conviction and death. So unsurprisingly, she accepted.
We came to the house where there were 5 witches. They commanded their spirits, some to kill a man's horse, some to lame a cow, lame a child.
Rebecca's testimony sealed the fate of the accused women.
Culpabilis o non culpabilis.
Culpabilis!
15 of the accused, including Elizabeth Clark, were found guilty and sentenced to death. Hopkins was victorious. It was the largest number of convictions in a single witch trial in English history.
On Friday the 18th of July, Elizabeth Clark, together with 14 other condemned women, was brought here to where the gallows stood in Chelmsford Market Square.
No! I didn't do anything! I didn't do it! I didn't do it!
Elizabeth Clark had to be helped up to have the noose put round her neck. Because, of course, she only had one leg.
Elizabeth Clark's only crime was to be poor, bad-tempered, and in the wrong place at the wrong time, when Hopkins was launching his career.
Execution was by the short drop. The victims died slowly of strangulation. These deaths made Hopkins' reputation. He used this to transform himself into something new and terrifying. Hopkins gave himself a grand new title, Witchfinder General. He became unrecognizable from the man who had stood quietly at the back of the meeting room in Manningtree.
This is a contemporary portrait of Hopkins. Notice what he's wearing. He's got a high-crowned hat, boots, spurs, and he's carrying a staff. He's the very image of a respected country magistrate. When someone dressed like this walks into a room, people are going to sit up and pay attention. And I think it's obvious that Hopkins has dressed himself like this to have the appearance of authority. I mean, what does a man in his 20s need with a staff except to have the symbol of a rank that he doesn't actually possess?
In just 4 short months, Hopkins had become one of the most feared men in Eastern England. His career was on a meteoric path. In the previous 20 years, just 2 women had been executed for witchcraft in East Anglia.
Culpabilis or non-culpabilis?
Culpabilis!
Hopkins had now sent 15 to the gallows in a single day. This wasn't just good for God, it was good for business. Because Hopkins received a fee for every one. News of his success at the Chelmsford witch trials began to spread beyond Essex. This is All Saints' Church in Brandeston, Suffolk. In 1645, the parishioners here published a pamphlet that accused a local man of witchcraft. Hopkins offered to help expose the witch, but he had absolutely no legal right to do so.
Hopkins' original permission came from 2 magistrates in Essex, which meant he actually didn't have legal authority to operate in other counties, such as Suffolk. But Hopkins was clearly feeling very confident. And why not? Not only did he genuinely think that he was doing God's work, but also in the chaos of civil war, who exactly was going to stop him?
This wasn't the only sign of Hopkins' growing confidence, because the witch he went after in Suffolk wasn't some poor, unloved, one-legged old crone. It was an ordained clergyman.
Hello? Is there somebody there?
Reverend John Lowes had been the vicar at Brandeston for over 40 years.
Hello?
But he was so disliked that his parishioners described him as naught but a foul witch.
How dare you! I am the man of God!
Tackling such a conspicuous target was risky for Hopkins.
Offend me! I am the man of God!
No serving clergyman had ever been convicted of witchcraft in England. So in this case, more than any other, Hopkins simply had to get a result.
Your parishioners think you're not but a witch. We'll see.
As ever, what Hopkins needed was a confession.
To extract a confession, Hopkins reused the procedure that had worked on Elizabeth Clark, sleep deprivation. But Hopkins had refined his technique. Instead of tying John Lowes to a chair, he made him run up and down the room every few minutes.
Lowes was walked constantly, for days.
When did you make the pact with the devil? Confess. Tell me the truth. I am your confessor.
No.
Hopkins had successfully used sleep deprivation many times to get a confession. It was the most extreme technique he could legally apply. But this time, it had failed. Hopkins' new career was under threat.
Hopkins had built an entire reputation on getting results when no one else could. So he took a momentous step. In order to get the results he wanted, he would break the law of the land. After all, in his mind, he was doing God's work.
Hopkins had a problem. He could not get Vicar John Lowes to confess to witchcraft. It threatened to damage his flawless reputation for success. To win, Hopkins would now do absolutely anything, including breaking the law.
On a freezing day in the winter of 1645, Hopkins' men dragged Vicar John Lowes, half naked and terrified, here to the moat at Framlingham Castle.
To try and break Lowes, Hopkins used a technique known as swimming the witch. It came highly recommended.
James I had written about it in his book, Demonology. He said that by accepting the devil, the witch rejected the sacred waters of baptism, and as a result, the water would reject the witch's body, and he or she would float. If the suspect floated, he was a witch and should be executed. But if the suspect hadn't rejected the waters of baptism, then he would sink as the waters embraced him, and he was proved innocent. Of course, there was also a great chance that he would drown. So by the time he arrived here, sink or swim, John Lowes was a dead man.
Whatever James I may have said about this test, it was considered torture, and therefore highly illegal. But Hopkins believed he could get away with it, as long as it got results. This decision would come back to haunt him. The 80-year-old vicar was bound with ropes and thrown into the ice-cold moat. Face down, partially drowning, it must have been a terrifying ordeal. There's no record of how many times John Lowes was plunged into the water. All we do know is the torture finally broke him.
I don't have to confess.
My imps killed cattle and sank ships.
Hopkins was victorious. But there was one thing Lowes would not admit.
I never made contact with the devil. Though my familiar tried to persuade me to do so.
Unlike the other accused, Lowes never confessed to making a pact with the devil. He gave Hopkins enough rope to hang him, but he never truly broke his covenant with God. He was, after all, a man of the cloth. You have to admire someone who clung to what he believed was right through the appalling sleep deprivation and partial drownings, and still would not yield that final inch. But Hopkins' gamble to use torture had paid off. And by the time Reverend Lowes was hauled into court a few months later, Hopkins already had 90 other witches on trial on that same day. So the old minister's claims that he'd been tortured had no chance of a fair hearing. He was found guilty of being a witch and was sentenced to death. In the summer of 1645, as Reverend John Lowes stood at the gallows, awaiting his death, he read his own funeral service.
I am the resurrection and the life. He who believeth in me, yea, though he were dead, that he shall live.
He had asked to do it himself. He probably didn't trust the ungodly people around him. And who could blame him?
Hopkins had now had a sitting vicar convicted and executed. He was using interrogation techniques that were expressly banned by law, and he was operating in 7 counties across the southeast of England, far beyond the legal limits of his original warrant. And no one stopped him.
And I suspect there's a good reason for that. What's really interesting about his success is that although Hopkins called himself a witch finder, he didn't actually have to find a single witch. Locals were doing all that for him.
Look at Elizabeth Clark. The local community essentially offered her up on a plate. She was bad-tempered and poor, a charity case who was a drain on village resources, and all she offered in return was cursing and swearing. And John Lowe's parishioners hated him so much they published a pamphlet denouncing him as a witch. How much easier life would be if people like that simply disappeared. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that towns and villages were using the witch hunts as a form of social cleansing, and Matthew Hopkins was simply the well-paid instrument of their will.
By the summer of 1646, villagers and towns across the southeast of England were clamouring for Hopkins' help. In July, he was in Norwich, where 20 witches met their end. In September, he was in Yarmouth, where 11 more were tried. Hopkins scored more successes at Yoxford, Weselton and Great Glenham. At its widest, his territory now spanned 300 miles. Hopkins was now overseeing hundreds of interrogations and attending countless trials. And he was receiving a fee for every one. But this success was storing up trouble for the witchfinder. The first warning signs can be found here in the archives of the East Suffolk Records Office. These are accounting ledgers from 1645 and 1646. They detail payments made to Hopkins.
In King's Lynn, they pay £15 to Mr. Hopkins for interrogating suspected witches, and a few weeks later they give him another £3 for acting as a witness. In Aldeburgh, we have him paid on a regular basis. So we have here on the 8th of September to Mr. Hopkins a gratuity for being in town for finding out witches of £2. He's paid the same amount on the 20th of December and again on the 7th of January. And here in Stowmarket, we have that he's paid £23 in the spring of 1646.
Matthew Hopkins may have started out doing God's work, but he had turned it into a very lucrative business. And the Witchfinder General's fee wasn't the only cost.
These accounts from Aldeburgh tell us how much it cost to execute a witch. So this reference here says, to William Daniel for the gallows and setting them up, £1, and for Henry Lawrence the roper for 7 halters and for making the knots, 8 shillings. We've got a cost here for the sundry men for watching days and nights over the witches, 13 shillings and 10p. In total, it adds up to something like £40, which would have been 1/7 of the town's yearly income. And to pay it, the town had to raise a massive additional tax. And it seems that this was a pattern that was repeated wherever Hopkins went. In short, Matthew Hopkins, Witchfinder General, was starting to hit people where it mattered, in their pockets.
Matthew Hopkins' reign of terror was about to come crashing down around him. This programme contains graphic recreations of scenes of historic brutality, including torture and hangings, which may distress some viewers. Matthew Hopkins' career as a freelance witch hunter had been a spectacular success.
I'm your confessor.
In just 2 years,
Search him.
he'd been responsible for the torture and execution of hundreds of accused witches. But this success would ultimately bring him down. People began to complain about the executions. It wasn't the killing they minded, it was the cost. At Brandeston in Suffolk, for example, parishioners refused to pay for the execution of their own vicar, John Lowes. People with serious objections to the witchfinder's cruel methods now joined the growing chorus of opposition against him. One man in particular would go to any lengths to bring him down.
John Gall was a Puritan preacher here in the village of Great Staunton. He hated everything that Matthew Hopkins stood for. And when he heard that the Witchfinder General was planning to come to his parish, he began to preach openly against him.
The office of Witchfinder is exceedingly doubtful. A trade that was not taken up in England till this time.
It was risky for a lowly priest to take on the superstar status of Hopkins, but Gall was too angry to care.
Before he discovers what?
He accused Hopkins of incompetence and self-interest. Hopkins' response to Gall's sermons was to go on the attack. He wrote to one of Gall's parishioners warning of the consequences of disagreeing with him on the matter of witches. He writes, "I have known a minister in Suffolk preach as much against their discovery in a pulpit and forced to recant it in the same place." This letter was a thinly veiled threat. He was reminding Reverend Gall that he'd already sent one vicar, John Lowes, to the gallows. He could easily do it again. But Hopkins was being overconfident. Gall wasn't intimidated. Instead, he went public. This is a copy of the book that John Gall wrote. It's called Select Cases of Conscience Touching Witches and Witchcraft. And in it, he says that Hopkins is just choosing easy targets. He says, every old woman with a wrinkled face, a furrowed brow, a hairy lip, a gobber tooth, a squint eye, a squeaking voice, or a scolding tongue, and a dog or cat by her side, is not only suspected, but pronounced for a witch. Gall went on to say that Hopkins had lucratory skill, which is to say the whole thing was a money-making scheme, that the Witchfinder had no special skill or ability and was a job that Hopkins had simply invented. It was a pretty damning attack. When Gall's book was published, it caught the attention of a group of influential Norfolk gentlemen. When they read it, they were outraged. In spring 1647, they went into open court in Norwich to present their objections to visiting Westminster judges. Hopkins' abusive techniques and his cavalier attitude to the law would be his undoing.
They must be tortured. Make them say anything, which is a way to tame a wild colt. Besides this unnatural watching, they were extraordinarily walked till their feet were blistered, and so through that cruelty forced to confess.
Hopkins' wisest course of action would probably have been to ignore the accusations. But they had thrown down a gauntlet, and Hopkins picked it up. He printed the accusations in a pamphlet alongside his defense. It was a disastrous mistake. This is an original copy of Matthew Hopkins' pamphlet. It's called The Discovery of Witches, and in it he prints the allegations made by the Norfolk gentleman against him, alongside his responses.
This one says, all that the witchfinder doth is to fleece the country of their money.
Therefore he rides, goes to towns to have employment, promises them fair promises, but it maybe doth nothing for it.
Hopkins denies everything.
I demand but 20 shillings a town. And that is the great sum it takes me to maintain a company with 3 horses.
We know from the surviving financial records that Hopkins was lying. He was routinely paid far more than 20 shillings. But the most astonishing thing about this book is that he reprints accusations of illegal torture. There have been an abominable, inhumane and unmerciful trial of these poor creatures by tying them and heaving them into the water, a trial not allowable by law or conscience, and I would fain know the reasons for that.
Hopkins justified his use of torture by quoting King James's book, Demonology.
King James in his Demonology saith, it is a certain rule, for saith he, witches deny their baptism when they covenant with the devil. So Hopkins' justification was that James, a king who had been dead for 22 years, had once approved of swimming witches. This was no kind of legal defence.
Hopkins failed to appreciate the danger of publicising the accusations of illegal torture and of fleecing the public. Demand for his skills evaporated. The Witchfinder General had hunted his last witch. We'll never know if Hopkins would have ended up in court for breaking the law, because fate intervened first. On Thursday, the 12th of August, 1647, in the village where his spectacularly bloody career began barely 2 years earlier, Hopkins died. Most probably of tuberculosis. In his short career, he'd been responsible for the death of over 100 innocent people.
Perhaps Hopkins truly believed he was doing God's work, but he was also a ruthless opportunist who used the persecution, suffering and death of innocent people to make his name and fortune.
The hatred and hysterical fear of witches that he kindled was not easily extinguished. Over the next 100 years, more than 500 innocent people were arrested, tried and hanged in the British Isles as witches. Hopkins' malign influence even crossed the Atlantic.
A trial 45 years after his death advocated the course that hath been taken in England for the discovery of witches. Hopkins had found new admirers in a small East Coast town in the Americas. It was called Salem. The 20 witches executed there added to Hopkins' legacy of suffering and death.